On the 11th of November 1918, the citizens of Germany woke up to some long-awaited news. The First World War, which had gone on for more than 4 years and had taken the lives of 2 million German soldiers, was finally over. In the early morning hours, a German delegation under the leadership of the Centre Party politician Matthias Erzberger had signed the armistice in a train wagon near Compiègne. A few hours later, the fighting stopped. Germany had undoubtedly lost the war. It had to retreat from all the occupied territories in France and Belgium, as well as from Alsace-Lorraine. It had to accept Allied occupations of all German territory west of the River Rhine, and also had to give up its weapons, U-boats, locomotives, lorries, and a lot of other military equipment. What followed after the relief was shock and disbelief. None of it made any sense. Were German troops not on enemy soil and therefore held the upper hand? Did the German army not recently defeat Russia and relocate a big portion of its fighting strength to the west? Weren't we told all this time that victory was so close and all we had to do was keep on fighting? Was all of the suffering, the hunger, the pain and the loss of loved ones simply in vain? A lot of German citizens began to ask this very question. In their eyes, the German army was never defeated on the field, but instead betrayed by a hostile element. Today we're going to take a very close look at the so-called stab in the back myth, a conspiracy theory that was often spread by right-wing nationalist groups to purposefully destabilize the young Weimar Republic. Who invented the stab in the back myth? Who spread it and why? And what role did it play in the eventual death of the first German democracy? First things first, I want to establish that there was no such thing as the stab in the back myth. Throughout the interwar years, it took on various different shapes and got more and more heinous as time went on. It initially started off as an attempt by the generals to put the blame away from them and the army, and instead redirect it towards the civilian population at home. Later, it developed into a full-on conspiracy theory which targeted the German left and accused them of purposefully sabotaging the war effort. Finally, the myth also received a racially anti-Semitic element, where Jews at home and abroad were charged with bringing about the German defeat. Over the course of this video, we're going to look at all of the different stages and discuss how they came about and how they influenced political discussions at that time. Since they roughly follow the chronological timeline of the Weimar Republic as well, this approach probably makes the most sense. Let's get started. Stage 1. It wasn't the generals' fault and they definitely had full control over the situation. In autumn of 1918, the military situation on the Western Front looked dire, to say the least. The Big Spring Offensive of the same year, which was supposed to finally bring about the German victory in the war, had failed catastrophically, and now the Allied powers were on the offensive. While the Allies' morale was still relatively high and their fighting strength was rapidly increasing due to the arrival of fresh American troops, the morale on the German side hit rock bottom. The German soldiers were completely exhausted. They began to capitulate en masse, and desertions became a common phenomenon. Between July and November, about 340,000 German soldiers became prisoners of war, which was about 10% of the entire army. The situation of Germany's allies was not much better either. In late September, Bulgaria was the first member of the Central Powers to sign an armistice, and all the others wouldn't hold out much longer. General Erich Ludendorff, the de facto leader of the German army, had failed across the board. In early October, he informed the other members of the Supreme Army Command at Spa of the hopeless situation and suggested opening up peace talks with the enemy. Ludendorff also instructed the Kaiser and the government in Berlin to ask for an armistice on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Furthermore, he told them, "However, I have asked His Majesty to now also bring to government those circles to whom we are mainly indebted for the fact that we have come this far. They should now conclude the peace that must now be concluded. Let them eat the soup that they have made for us." This shows that Ludendorff was completely unwilling to take responsibility for these actions and instead blamed those circles. Who were they? Ludendorff was a convinced nationalist and a staunch authoritarian who despised the democratic parties who were sitting in the Reichstag. In his eyes, a complete military dictatorship would have been required to bring this war to a successful end, and the insistence of the democratic parties on creating a democratic government had only undermined the war effort. Now that German defeat was absolutely certain, Ludendorff hoped that the introduction of a new government supported by democratic parties and under the leadership of the liberal prince Max von Baden might mitigate the Allies' peace conditions. Behind this idea was a devilish plan. Should the peace treaty be harsh and unpopular, the democratic leadership would take the blame for it, as they would be the ones to accept it, while the military would simply shirk responsibility. Unfortunately, this plan worked. As all of Germany's other allies left the war, it had no other options but to accept the armistice conditions imposed on it by the Allies. During the journey of the delegation under Erzberger, on the 9th of November, the social democratic politician Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the German Republic, and the Kaiser fled to Holland, like a coward. The social democrat Friedrich Ebert became the German president in February of 1919. In autumn of the same year, Germany accepted the Peace Treaty of Versailles, as a result of which it lost 1/7 of its territory and was forced to pay massive reparations. As you probably know, the treaty was very unpopular, and some people began to look for a culprit to blame for the shame of Versailles, and the thing many people asked was, why did we lose this war? German nationalist circles had a very simple answer to this question. They argued that it wasn't the army which had failed, but the civilian population at home. They had allegedly lost morale in the most crucial moment, and had they not given up, the soldiers might have kept on fighting. The proof for this claim was an article published in December 1918 in die Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the most important Swiss newspaper at the time. The newspaper had published an article called "An English General About the Causes of the German Collapse," in which the author claimed to be directly citing Frederick Maurice, a former British general who had become a renowned war analyst. The article concluded by saying that, as far as the German army is concerned, the general view can be summarized in one word. It was stabbed in the back by the civilian population. Maurice later vehemently denied ever having made such a statement, and it's most likely that the Neue Zürcher Zeitung journalist simply made it up. But the damage was already done. To many German militarists and nationalists, the belief that a former war enemy would say such a thing in an acclaimed newspaper from a neutral country like Switzerland was evidence enough. Erich Ludendorff was one of the most influential people who spread the idea that the army could easily have kept on fighting had it not been for the civilians losing their fighting spirit back home. Which is complete nonsense, as is proven by the fact that the morale of the German soldiers was next to non-existent after Ludendorff's failed spring offensive. The reason why this narrative managed to become so widespreadly believed was the fact that shortly after the outbreak of the war in 1914, the German military had set up an elaborate control system, which included censorship of the press, as well as defamation and imprisonment of politicians who spoke up against the war. Until the very end, the German public was constantly lied to about the actual state at the front, so it's not surprising that many people assumed that it couldn't have been the military that had failed. In August of 1919, an official parliamentary inquiry into guilt for World War I was held. In it, Paul von Hindenburg, Ludendorff's partner in the Supreme Army Command, was asked to give a testimony. At that time, Hindenburg was a national hero, and during the war he had been sort of a replacement Kaiser with his tall stature and his stern look. During the inquiry, Hindenburg said, "An English general rightly said, the German army has been stabbed in the back. Where the blame lies is clearly proven. If further proof were needed, it lies in the English general's statement and in the utter astonishment of our enemies at their victory." Clearly, he was referring to the newspaper article we had talked about earlier. Due to Hindenburg's status in large layers of German society, his words were taken as indisputable truths, and the stab-in-the-back myth reached the mainstream discourse. In its very early stages, the stab-in-the-back myth was not so much a conspiracy theory, but rather a vague accusation by the military directed at the home front and the Reichstag politicians for their loss of morale. That changed very shortly after the parliamentary inquiry, when a clear culprit was found: the socialists and the pacifists. Stage 2. It was the evil socialist revolutionaries who betrayed Germany because they are evil. In the 1920s, the ultra-patriot right began to spread the narrative that it was actually the November Revolution and the multiple worker strikes that happened during the war that were responsible for the defeat. They began to accuse the Social Democrats and the revolutionaries of purposefully undermining and sabotaging the morale at home to bring about a German defeat. In regards to the German Revolution, this claim made no sense because, remember, Ludendorff pressured the government to open up peace talks with the Allies in early October 1918, almost a whole month before the first sailors' mutiny in Wilhelmshaven broke out, so the war was over long before the revolution even started. And the strikes were the result of gradually worsening living conditions and not part of a socialist conspiracy. The fact that the army's morale had dissolved after Ludendorff's disastrous spring offensive, and not because of some conspirators, didn't matter to many nationalist politicians and journalists who accused the Social Democratic Party of supporting workers' unrest to purposefully weaken the country's morale. One such example was the Mitteldeutsche Zeitung, which published an article in early 1924 accusing the president, Friedrich Ebert, of treason against the fatherland for having supported the striking workers in January of 1918. Ebert refused to put up with this and dragged the newspaper before court, arguing that he and the majority Social Democratic Party had only joined the strike committee to gain control and to end the unrest as quickly as possible. Unfortunately for him, the judge during the process, as was usually the case with judges and state officials in the Weimar Republic, was a convinced anti-republican and a conservative who sided with the newspaper. In the end, the accused journalist got fined for insulting Ebert, but the verdict openly stated that the president himself is objectively guilty of treason. He had sympathized with the workers' call for peace and even urged them to continue the strike. Whether it was his intention to bring harm to Germany or not, did not seem to matter. In the same year, another process which spread the idea of a socialist conspiracy was held in Munich. This time, Nikolaus Kossmann, the editor of the Süddeutsche Monatshefte, published countless documents which were supposed to prove that the Social Democrats were responsible for the end of the monarchy and the Peace of Versailles. The verdict was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the majority Social Democrats were acquitted of the charge of treason, and the questioning of countless witnesses showed clearly that the morale of the German soldiers was definitely breaking apart quickly as well. On the other hand, this just didn't matter. To the nationalist right, the stab-in-the-back myth was an objective truth. Due to the political polarization of the Weimar Republic, most people just picked out all the aspects of the trial that confirmed their own worldview and simply ignored everything else. As such, the trial only helped to spread the stab-in-the-back myth even more. One of the few conservatives who actively fought against the stab-in-the-back myth was the military historian Hans Delbrück, former member of the Reichstag and professor at the University of Berlin. After the war, Delbrück became captivated by the background of the defeat in 1918 and made it his life goal to find out who was really behind it. His arguments must have stung a lot more than those of a Social Democrat, for example, because he was a stereotypical monarchist Prussian. He soon became one of Erich Ludendorff's biggest adversaries, and he wanted to make sure that the former general wouldn't just get away with his fabricated myth. In Delbrück's eyes, the military was not just responsible, but guilty of Germany's defeat. Ever since the outbreak of the war, the generals had done too little to achieve a reasonable peace deal with the Allies and were instead obsessed with gaining a complete victory. This is what caused the death of the monarchy, and not the revolution. He accused Ludendorff of denying the consequences of his failed spring offensive in 1918 and not properly informing the German government of the real situation at the front. His sudden demand for an immediate armistice had broken the morale of the German people and laid the groundwork for the German Revolution. In letters, Delbrück described Ludendorff as an insufficient field commander, as morally deficient, really stupid, and considered him to be an egomaniacal, irresponsible corrupter of Germany, a dependent moron. During the aforementioned trial in Munich of 1924, Delbrück was brought in as an expert. He presented his arguments, accusing Ludendorff and the generals of being the main culprits for the defeat and exposing the stab-in-the-back myth as pure bollocks. His words received a huge echo in the German press, as Delbrück had no personal reason or motive to combat the myth so vehemently as he did. Sadly, Delbrück died in 1929, while the conspiracy theory he had fought so hard persisted. Stage 3. It was the Jews all along, because it just wouldn't be a proper conspiracy theory without some good old fucking anti-Semitism, now would it? The stab in the back myth was not necessarily anti-Semitic. In itself, it was mainly targeted against the socialist revolutionaries and the democratic politicians, oftentimes called the Novemberverbrecher or November criminals, referring to the month the armistice was signed in. Some very radical versions of the conspiracy theory, however, included some wildly anti-Semitic claims. In the late 19th century, the traditional Christian form of anti-Semitism got gradually replaced by a more racially motivated anti-Semitism, which saw Judaism not as a religion, but as a race. By many people, Jews were seen as naturally unpatriotic and subversive. This line of thinking was especially present among the militaristic nationalist right, which can be observed in the now infamous Judenzählung or Jewish census of 1916. In response to the demands from anti-Semitic circles in the military and in the Reichstag, who accused Germany's Jewish population of deliberately avoiding frontline service, the Prussian War Minister, Adolf Wild von Hohenborn, put a statistical census in place. Its goal was to prove the baseless allegation that Jewish soldiers mostly served in non-combat roles behind the front line and were more rarely found in direct fighting positions. The census was incredibly flawed, and it broke basically every single principle of proper statistics. In the end, the Judenzählung proved nothing, and exactly because the census failed to prove the claim that Jews were underrepresented in combat roles, the statistic was never published by the War Ministry. The fact that it never saw the public light only reinforced anti-Semitic stereotypes of inherent Jewish disloyalty and hatred towards Germany. After the war, the Alldeutscher Verband, a numerically small but highly influential chauvinistic, imperialist and nationalist organization, founded the Deutsch-Völkischer Schutz- und Trutzbund. The Bund's main activity consisted of spreading primitive conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic propaganda. Due to the economic and political turmoil in the early years of the Weimar Republic, the propaganda was incredibly effective, and shortly before its dissolution, the Bund had up to 180,000 members. For example, in a flyer, the Bund claimed that democracy was the real precursor to the political domination and economic conquest of the German people by Judaism. Makes sense. It portrayed the German Revolution as the result of a Jewish plot to make Germany lose the war for reasons. In another 1919 publication called Judas Guildbook, of which 30,000 copies were sold, the Schutz- und Trutzbund claimed that all the events in the preceding decade were the result of Jewish decomposition of German society. They accused various personalities of having been part of a Jewish conspiracy, including former Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, Matthias Erzberger, Philipp Scheidemann, and even Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. Proof or sources didn't exist, it was all simply made up. Alright, now, enough of all this. What effect did the various shapes of the stab-in-the-back myth actually have on Weimar society? Many, even maybe most Germans, did not pay much attention to it or outright denied it. This obviously included Social Democrats and Communists, but also the moderate and Republican parties. Most of the believers in the conspiracy theory stemmed from the nationalist right, who romanticized the good old days of the authoritarian imperial regime and detested the new democracy. Some smaller groups mostly believed in the anti-Semitic version. All in all, the stab-in-the-back myth only dominated within a small but highly influential and destructive political fringe group on the right. All versions of the conspiracy theory were fabricated and were pure fantasies, nothing more. But as is the case with pretty much every single conspiracy theory, the truth doesn't matter much. In the end, Erich Ludendorff's scheme worked out. He got out of the whole ordeal virtually unscathed and never faced any real consequences for his failures. Despite the parliamentary inquiry and the court trials, countless Germans genuinely believed that it wasn't the Kaiser or the military who had brought about the defeat in the First World War, but instead the civilian population, the socialists or the Jews. In their eyes, Germany could have won the war had it not been for their betrayal. This damaged the fundamentals of the Weimar democracy and partially paved the way for the rise of the National Socialists. To the National Socialists, the stab-in-the-back myth was, perhaps surprisingly, only of small importance, and it was barely brought up in speeches or newspaper articles. Hitler only mentioned it once in Mein Kampf. Instead, the Nazis largely blamed the November criminals, so the imperial government and the politicians who signed the armistice for failing to bring about a German victory. One reason for this is that the party was trying to appeal in part to women and old men who had stayed at home during the war, and accusing them of stabbing the German nation in the back is not a good way to bring them to your side. Obviously, they accused the Jews of being the main conspirators of the November Revolution, but they saw a Jewish conspiracy in essentially everything they disliked. After the German defeat in 1945, the Allies were well aware of the effect the conspiracy theory had and put an awareness and education program in place, which included the Nuremberg trials. The Allies also made sure that there was no second Versailles and that the mistakes of the interwar era were not repeated. This was a successful endeavour, as a new stab-in-the-back myth didn't emerge in destroyed post-war Germany. Still, the stab-in-the-back myth is a prime example today that shows how historical events can be manipulated and distorted to create a new truth, and what kind of destructive effects a conspiracy theory can have. Anyway, that's all for today. As always, a big dankeschön for watching, and I hope you liked the video and learned something useful. If you did, a like and a subscribe would be much appreciated. I would like to give a huge and heartfelt shout out to my kind supporters over on Ko-Fi. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh and Nico. You are absolutely phenomenal. Have a very nice day and see you next time.